Welcome, everyone, to a live taping of our Afikra podcast. Our special guest is Kim Ghattas, who is an award-winning journalist, author, and Middle East expert. Kim has over 20 years of on-air experience as a radio and television correspondent and anchor for the BBC and the Financial Times, and is a contributing writer for The Atlantic. We're talking today with Kim about her brand new podcast, People Like Us, as well as her best-selling books, The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power, and Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. Kim, welcome to Afikra.
Hi, Mikey. It's great to be here.
It's so nice to have you. I remember the first time we met a few years ago at Salon Beirut, and we were talking about Afikra, and you were in the middle of writing, or maybe at the beginning of writing Black Wave. So it's nice to be reconnected so many years later. Let me ask you the first question, which is, if I was sitting down with teenager Kim, did teenager Kim think that she was going to be a journalist writing about the Middle East, spending 20 years writing about the Middle East?
Actually, yes, because teenager Kim decided at the age of 13 that she wanted to be a journalist. I may not have been able to predict exactly how my career was going to unfold. I may not have envisioned books or a conversation with you or a podcast like People Like Us, but I did want to be a journalist from the age of 13. And I think there were several reasons why, and I, in fact, sat down at one point to write them out as I was trying to decide what I should be when I was going to grow up. As you know, children get asked all the time, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I decided I had to have a serious answer for that. I'd had several iterations preceding my decision to be a journalist. I wanted to be a detective at some point. And I read a lot of detective stories, and I had a detective manual, the old-fashioned one with the, how to get prints of things, etc., how to solve a mystery. So actually, from there to being a journalist is not, a huge step, because as journalists, we elucidate the facts as well. And so I sat down and wrote, in essence, an essay to myself, where I went through the different things that I like to do. I really enjoyed taking pictures, so I enjoyed photography, but that wasn't enough, because I also really enjoyed writing. I loved writing. I was good at it. I really loved being around people, and I loved food and cooking. So I thought maybe a hotel or a restaurant, but I didn't want to be tied down in one place. And I also felt very driven to explain or try to understand. As a kid, you're not explaining anything yet. You're trying to understand the world around you. And I felt that if only I could explain to the outside world what was happening in Lebanon, maybe the war would end, because we were still living through the civil war at the time, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. So combining those different things together, photography, writing, enjoying being around people, talking to people, asking questions, and wanting to say more to the world about Lebanon, I came to the conclusion that I had to be a journalist. And I pursued that in a very, very determined, dogged way until I got there.
Do you feel like your primary responsibility is to explain things out loud to yourself, or to explain things to other people so that they understand the world that you are living in? Do you feel like you understand the problems before you actually project them outwards, or are you really in this conversation with yourself?
I don't pretend to understand the problems better than others. Otherwise, I would have found the solution to the road to world peace. It's a conversation with myself, in the sense that I'm trying to explain or trying to find the facts that enable us to understand what is happening around us. And it is a conversation with myself to the extent that it has to also to some extent interest me, right? And it has to be part of my base of knowledge. I would like to understand, climate change better and the science behind it, but I'm not that kind of journalist. So I focus on international politics, on international relations, on foreign policy, on Middle Eastern contemporary history. And that then becomes a conversation, of course, with the readers, the viewers, the listeners, who are really my primary focus when I'm doing my work, and have been my primary focus from the moment I started as a young upstart journalist writing for the Daily Star, and also working as what we call a stringer and fixer for foreign news organizations. So international journalists, American journalists who come to Lebanon, and they would want somebody to take them around and translate for them and make appointments for them with politicians or activists or cultural icons, etc. And that was me in my Volkswagen, picking them up from the airport and driving them around and translating for them. And I learned a lot from the greats of American journalists by doing that. I really started in a way at the bottom, while also doing an internship at the Daily Star and doing translation for their star reporter, Nicholas Blanford, covering South Lebanon. So I'm not actually sure that saying it's a conversation between me and myself is the right way. It's only a conversation with myself in the sense that I have to first understand what I'm trying to explain to others. But I'm really incredibly focused on what others might be interested in, and where are the spots of darkness that I can shed light on, and how can I make this chaotic world that we live in feel just a little bit less incomprehensible. And that's in a way how it started, right? Growing up in Lebanon during a war, wondering, why the hell doesn't it end? Who can do something about this? And then growing up, of course, you realize it's not that simple. There isn't any one person or any one country even that can push a button and change the direction of things or put an end to a conflict. And I remember, and we'll talk maybe about my book, The Secretary. I remember when I was traveling with the Secretary of State doing that job as a BBC correspondent, I realized from the questions that these American officials were getting, why is America doing this? Why doesn't America do that? Why don't you tell, our president he should, release this activist? Why don't you, stop providing weapons to this or that country? I realized that, people still have the same questions. And so the kind of questions that I had growing up. So in a way, I've remained true to my mission to try to elucidate some of those answers to the extent that you can in what is a very complex world.
Yeah. I'm curious about this book in particular. I wanted to ask you, but I'm glad that you brought it up. So for those who can't see the screen, this is called The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power. I'm curious, who do you think the public was in your mind as you were writing this book? Was it primarily American voters who are trying to think through what the White House should do and the relationship between the White House and the Arab world and how it affects their daily lives? Or were you thinking sort of a more global audience or a Middle Eastern audience as well?
In fact, I was thinking about both, because the book is really a journey. I'm on a plane with the Secretary of State. In this instance, it was Hillary Clinton, whom I covered for 4 years. And we traveled around the world, and we went from Pakistan to Morocco to Kenya to China and Japan. And, we went everywhere. I traveled 300,000 miles with her. And you're really sitting, you have a front row seat to the making of American foreign policy. And you can ask American officials all the questions that you want. And sometimes they'll answer in full detail, and sometimes they'll obfuscate. But I always found that Clinton and her team were quite forthcoming and were willing to engage in a thoughtful conversation to try to explain their point of view. And they were also willing to listen. So the book that I've written is a journey It is my journey as somebody who grew up on the receiving end of American power, trying to now elucidate and try to shed light on how American power works, having achieved the next step in my career where I end up on a plane with the Secretary of State traveling around the world, including to Beirut. It is a journey into the machine of American foreign policy. And it is a machine. I mean, it's huge. The State Department alone is a massive building. And then you have the Pentagon and you have the executive office of the president, which sits next door to the White House. And then you have the National Security Council. And, in countries like ours and in the Middle East or elsewhere in China, where decision-making is much more top-down, the person at the top says it and therefore it shall be done. It's much more messy within an administration.
Bureaucratic.
Trying to explain a little bit how that works and who are the human beings at the heart of this machine, fallible human beings who don't have all the answers themselves as much as we think they do. They actually don't. And they're trying to do the best they can for their country, of course, with the information that they have at hand, which they're getting in real time. And so the result is a book that is addressed both to an American audience, which is why it was a bestseller in the US, to try to explain to them how their foreign policy is seen in the rest of the world, what role their country plays in this global order, to the benefit very often, of course, of the US itself. And I think that's something that became a real topic of debate and acrimony in the 2016 election in the US, where there is this reflexive tendency inside the electorate in the US to reject American power and involvement abroad. And, we can go into the goods and bads of that. But it also became a book definitely addressed to a global audience, which has questions about what is America? What is America about? And what is this foreign policy machine? And how does it work? And why does it sometimes not work? And what are the mistakes that are being made and why? To try to sort of, shed a light on something that is often discussed in sort of nefarious terms. There's a plot, there's a decision, there's a game being played. And of course, realpolitik is often a heartless game, but it's less dark and less methodical than we sometimes tend to believe.
Yeah, I'm always curious about people in your position who have seen it from the vantage point that I have right now, but also from the inside, right? From the inside of that incredible...
Inside with limits, obviously.
I mean, inside of the plane, at least.
Yeah, I'm not sitting in the situation room, but you are on the plane.
You're on the plane, right?
Example, you're on the plane in March 2011. Ben Ali's just fallen in Tunisia. Hosni Mubarak has just fallen in Egypt. There's an uprising starting or ongoing in Libya. It's starting in Syria. There's demonstrations in Bahrain. The Saudis and the Emiratis are sending armed forces into Bahrain across the causeway. There's a tsunami in Japan. And we're on the plane with the Secretary of State, and this briefing book that she has is just a mess because things are changing in real time. And officials with her, we're supposed to be traveling to the Middle East, to Egypt, and to Tunisia. And first we make a stop in Paris because she's meeting her counterparts from the G7. The Libyans are there, the Emiratis are there, the Japanese are there because of the tsunami, and it's all happening in real time. So you really get a sense of what a country like the United States has to deal with as a superpower in real time. And in fact, this what I'm describing now is part of my latest episode of the podcast, People Like Us, where I interview Jeffrey Feltman, who is a former ambassador to Lebanon, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and later top diplomat at the UN. And he explains and he takes you inside what it's like to, as Americans like to say, use this expression, walk and chew gum at the same time. They were having to walk, chew gum, and juggle, with their arms and legs at the same time.
Well, let me ask you a question about this, because given that perspective, I wonder what advice would you have to, young people across the Arab world who are trying to better understand how to engage with American foreign policy, right? And how to sort of productively figure out how can we use this relationship for our own interests? Everyone's working in their own interests, but when there is misunderstanding, there is lack of efficiency, there is lack of productivity. And so as young people all across the Arab world are trying to understand, okay, we need to better understand American foreign policy and the State Department, how the State Department actually works, not how it may work in our imagination, how it actually works. What is the best way that we can begin to work with this very complicated institution in order to further our own objectives?
So this is an interesting question, and the answer is not straightforward. So first of all, if you want to better understand how it works, without wanting to sort of blow my own horn, read the book, right? Really, because it is written in a very accessible way for a wide public. It is narrative, it's a story, but it's nonfiction. And you'll travel around the world, you'll get an inside tour of the American foreign policy machine, and you'll get a better granular understanding of what drives some of the foreign policy making and what drives some of the people. With the caveat that from one presidency to the next, things change. In a way, this is a document of history because, then by 2016, we got President Trump, and the way he made foreign policy was, like no one else had ever seen. The interview with Jeffrey Feltman is really, I find, very insightful. You have to remember that as a BBC correspondent, I was there to ask the tough questions, and I took officials to task, and I prodded and pushed and tried to get, difficult answers out of them, whether it was Clinton or Condoleezza Rice or John Kerry or others. In these interviews, and there'll be one of those for every episode, for every season that we do with people like us, the purpose is to shed more light rather than, have a heated debate or a heated conversation. So I ask questions that are challenging, but that allow Jeff to, take us into the process, whether he's meeting Ali Khamenei later as diplomat at the UN or going to Pyongyang, and how a visit like this happens, right? So this is in terms of the machinery. Second, yes, there are a lot of misunderstandings between the Middle East and the US for many, many reasons, because of US involvement and the way it is involved in the region, because of its unequivocal support for Israel, because of its support for dictators like Hosni Mubarak at the time, but Abdel Fattah al-Sisi today. And so the misunderstanding is twofold. It's the misunderstanding, the difficult relationship between the US and the region. And then it's the misunderstanding and the vast chasm between us as a young generation and our own leaders, let alone America, right? You have to understand that America is pursuing its own interests. And what we have to do as citizens of this region is try to get through in every way we know possible, with our own podcasts, with our own books, with our own interviews on international media, with our own engagement as activists, as NGO workers, as entrepreneurs, that it is in America's interests to get beyond the dichotomy of dictators or instability, right? That's how America sees the region. If you have instability in the region, you can't secure shipping lanes, you can't secure access to oil, you can't secure Israel's security. And that just becomes a mess, which is kind of where they tried to go with the Arab uprisings. Obama wanted to give it a chance, and then very quickly they gave up because, they're on this, 4-year cycle. You could argue it's even a 2-year cycle. Every 2 years there are elections for the midterms, and then there's a presidential election. And so they don't have time to move the ship, which is a huge ship, in a different direction in time for it to deliver results so that these results can be sustainable. And so it's also up to us to change the conversation in the region with our elected leaders to run for elections, to change the face of the political scene in the region, so that we, as I'm not Gen Z, but everyone coming behind me as Gen Z, or everyone who's still looking for a better future for this region, that we are able to get across and really show what governance and justice and accountability can do for this region, for us, because we deserve it, and for American interests, because America is not a charity organization, right? They're not going to remove a dictator only because, it suits us as the people. They're not going to stop importing oil from Saudi Arabia because, they don't like Mohammed bin Salman, although they were trying to get there. And it didn't work. Again, it didn't work. America has interests, just like Mohammed Fattah al-Sisi has his own interests. Everyone has their own interests. Yeah. And so it's not realistic to expect them to go against American national interests. What we need to do is to find ways to align our interests for a better future and America's interests.
Okay. I want to move on. I want to talk a little bit about your next book project, which is in many ways it's very different, because with The Secretary, you're looking at the contemporary sort of world as it's unfolding. You're on the plane, it's a diary of sorts. You're saying, oh my God, this is happening right now. Let me walk you through this entire story. Take me back to the moment that you decided that you would focus on a series of events in the 70s and afterwards, and why you decided to try to explain this story to yourself and to the world.
So Black Wave is very much a continuation of my reflection, or the reflection I did while I was writing The Secretary. And my next book, the third book, which I'm just starting to work on right now, is an amalgam of both of those books and the continuation of my reflection. When I was researching The Secretary, I came across the events of 1979 in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, the siege of Mecca, which happens in November of that year, when Saudi Sunni zealots lay siege to the mosque for 2 weeks, try to, in essence, I'm summarizing and simplifying, in essence, trying to make the House of Saud kowtow to their demands, which have been fed by the conservative clerical establishment, and making demands of the House of Saud to, for one, distribute the profits of oil much more equally between the people, eject all foreigners from the Arabian Peninsula, and generally be better Muslims. So I knew about the Islamic Revolution, or the Iranian Revolution of 1979. I knew about the invasion of Afghanistan at the end of 1979, but I didn't know about the siege of Mecca. So that was how that sort of started. I started wondering, what's all this stuff happening at the same time in 1979? The other event that I started digging into a bit more as well while I was researching The Secretary were events in Lebanon in the 1980s, with the attacks against the Marine barracks, the embassy bombings, the hijackings, the kidnappings, etc. And trying to place those in context in terms of American foreign policy and what that did at the time to America's posture in the world, and how that became, the ground zero for what we called Fortress America, right? Big embassies behind big blast walls. It didn't used to be like that. You could, used to be able to walk into an embassy. It was in Beirut in particular, it was on the Corniche, and, it wasn't protected. It had some protection, but nothing like what we see today with embassies around the world, not just in Lebanon. And then what happened was 2014, on top of that, we had the rise of ISIS, which took over parts of Iraq and Syria and imposed this, gruesome, bloody rule, which came also with a cultural desertification, the breaking of statues, the ransacking of libraries, which, made me think back to the time when I was in Saudi Arabia and visiting, Saudi Arabia, reporting on Saudi Arabia, and getting to a better understanding of their Salafi Hanbali interpretation of Islam or school of Islam. The term that we use is Wahhabism. The Saudis don't like that. And, being confronted with the lack of museums, the lack of portraits, the lack of statues, except for the Corniche in Jeddah. And then that same year, speaking to my sister about a visit of hers to southern Lebanon, where she had gone with one of her friends who was from the south, and who told her how different life was before the 80s and the 70s, when they had, village festivals and, dabke in this village square, etc. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. We've already been through a kind of cultural desertification in the region. It happened after the revolution of Iran, as Iran started trying to export its Islamic revolution and its ideals of how, Shi'ism should be understood and lived. And so all of these combined made me think that I was onto something about the year 1979 and what a turning point it had been for the region, beyond a geopolitical turning point, because there are many geopolitical turning points in the region and in world history. This was also a cultural, social, and religious turning point, which had an impact on the region for the following 40 years, to the point where today we often look back and think, what happened to us, which is the opening question of the book.
Sure, Sarfina. I love that. I love the opening paragraph.
And it's not, I do want to say, it's not asked in a sort of nostalgic, oh, it used to be so much better, but in a more, let's shed light.
It's like a diagnostic question.
Exactly. It's a diagnostic question, because once you have the diagnosis, you might be able to find a way forward. You can't go back into time. You need to build your future differently. But what can we learn from who we are and who we were that can make us a better version of ourselves in the future?
Kim, I remember very clearly that day at Salon Beirut when we were sitting down a few years ago, and you
for a research assistant.
You were looking for a research assistant, which I'm very happy.
I do want to give them credit. I could not have done this book without them. I could not have written Black Wave without the incredible work of Ziad Diaghi and Misha Tobia. I mean, they were just fantastic, digging into archives, scanning newspapers, writing briefs, transcribing interviews. I think we did the work of 6 years in just 2, and they deserve, all the credit for making it possible for me to deliver on time. Teamwork, whether you're a journalist in the field, whether you're writing a book, or whether you are producing a podcast, teamwork, collaborations is just a gift to people who create. And I see that Noor Abdel Latif, the social media manager for the podcast, People Like Us, is just logged on. So I want to, give thanks to her as well, because she has done an incredible job promoting People Like Us on social media, and is always full of ideas and full of creativity. And that's what makes working on these projects just so fantastic.
Absolutely. So in that moment, I remember asking you, what are you working on these days? And you said, I'm working on this new book, and it's about 1979. And I'll out myself. I remember saying, what do you mean 1979? What happened in 1979? I mean, I know Iran, but I didn't know anything about the siege in Mecca, right? Mm-hmm. But there are many, many people who are much more informed than I am. I'm curious, when you were pitching this story around to people, or just talking about it around dinner tables and at cafes and at bars in Beirut or around the region, did everyone say, oh, yeah, 1979? Well, of course, everyone knows that was the moment. Everyone knows that is
such a good question. That is such a good question, Mikey, because it took me a very long time between, that you were asking me earlier, the conversation with myself. Every project also starts first with a conversation with yourself, in the sense that you're testing the thesis, you're not too sure about telling others, you're stress testing your idea, your your thesis. And I remember I was racked with self-doubt because I thought I was onto something, but I just couldn't be sure. So I went out and I spoke to a lot of people. And the more I talked.
Kim, I can't hear you. Hold on. Am I the only one? Please.
Pivotal. And just for, those who have not read the book or haven't heard of it, it is also written in a narrative nonfiction style. It is, in the words of some of the readers, the feedback that I've gotten, written almost like a thriller. You really want to know what happens next, even though obviously you know how it ends because, we're all living in this region, whether we're in Pakistan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia. So the book is really a tale of 40 years of events unfolding from Pakistan all the way to Egypt, with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in between, and telling it through the lives of the people who were impacted by the geopolitics. So the geopolitics is the backdrop, but the story is the story of these incredible characters whom I meet in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, in Egypt. And what I found, and I write about it a little bit in the introduction, when I went to speak to them, whether it's Mehtab Rashdi, the Pakistani television anchor who stands up to the dictator Zia al-Haq and says, no, I am not going to wear a veil on television. Who are you to tell me how I should behave as a Muslim woman? I know my religion. Or whether it's, Ibtihal Yunus in Egypt, a professor of French literature whose husband, Nasser Abu Zaid, and her end up having to go in exile because he's accused of blasphemy. When I went to them and I said, tell me about 1979, I felt like I was a therapist and they were just, suddenly this flood of emotions came out. Yes, 1979. Well, let me tell you how it wrecked my life, how it wrecked my career, how it changed my destiny, how it undid, my family. It was this flood of stories that came out.
It's like the scene of the crime. Finally, somebody's asking about this.
Yeah, but it wasn't an easy sell at the beginning for publishers in the US. And I really have to give credit to my agent and my editor, who really believed in the project and who fought hard for the book to be bought. Because the way that it works, you write a proposal, and the proposal took me a year because I was stress testing this thesis in every single direction. Yeah. You write a proposal, at least that's how it works for nonfiction. You write the proposal, and then your agent chops it around to publishers. I already had the publisher of The Secretary, so we went to them. And, my editor at the publishing house was keen to have me, but she has to convince others around the table at the publisher. And it was, another story about the Middle East. Haven't we heard this before? Sunnis, Shias killing each other, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Yeah, it's more of the same. And it took some explaining, because short of writing the whole book, I had to come up with a very succinct way of explaining why this was going to be different. And the result is this book. And the result is also Black Wave being nominated by the New York Times as one of the top 100 notable books of 2020.
So how do you avoid, and this is more of a journalistic question, and in many ways I'm asking for a friend, how do you avoid and you do this extremely well, this is why I'm asking you, how do you avoid falling into the trap of, sensationalizing this stuff, or, portraying the real bad Arab, this region strife with conflict and war and hatred and anger and tension, and how do you avoid that pigeonhole and actually slap some humanity on the characters?
Because we are not that stereotype. We are a multitude, a diversity, a rich, culturally rich, socially diverse region that deserves to be better understood and appreciated by the world, away from the stereotypes and away from the black and white headlines in the media. So I don't find it difficult at all to avoid those black and white depictions, because the region is full of nuance. And that's also what I tried to do with this book, Black Wave, when and I want to point out also, the book is full of poetry, references to music, to fiction, artists. I wanted to showcase the richness of this region. And I'm not talking about oil rich, and I'm not talking about minerals.
I guess what I'm asking is not how you, Kim, have the ability to do that. Obviously, you do.
How do I avoid editors?
How do you avoid editors and the sort of the natural market gravity downwards towards those tropes? And maybe there is no gravity and it's sort of imagined.
There is a certain gravity around the world to simplify everything. And it's not just with the Middle East. I mean, look at how things get simplified into polarization in the US media about America itself. I think definitely. It leads to deep misunderstandings about what is happening within the US. This desire to be on one extreme or the other leaves out a whole middle center that also wants to say something and also wants to be understood, that is not, only Trump or only Biden. There's a whole shades of differences in the middle. And so I have great faith in working with the right people. So my editor, my agent, occasionally they say, can you spice it up a bit? And I'm like, no, actually, no.
It's pretty spicy.
Spice it up. I got that a little bit with the secretary, to sort of make it a bit more fun, a bit more. And I'm sorry. I mean, I wish I were more fun. Maybe my writing, maybe I would be able to write about more fun subjects. But they wanted the secretary initially. There was one person at my literary agency that thought the secretary could be more of a traveling sisterhood type book. And I'm boring. It's just not who I am. And so I put back really hard. I said, no, I'm not writing that kind of book. I'm writing a serious geopolitical book that will be accessible to a wide audience, because I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic. And so I don't know how to write in a very straightforward, I don't want to say dry, because a lot of academics write in a great way, but my audience is always the wider public.
Yeah.
With the Black Wave, I did not get any pushback. So I have faith in writing, in working with incredible people, and I have faith in the people who are listening and the people who are reading, whether they're watching on the BBC when I'm reporting, or whether they're listening to me on the radio, or reading my articles in the FT during, at the beginning of my career, or reading my books. And I think if you stay true to yourself, you can get through. It takes more work, and you may not achieve, massive fame. I'm quite pleased with, how far I've gotten. And I'm incredibly pleased with the podcast as well, because the podcast does exactly what you're describing, Mikey. It tries to stay in the middle. And the middle is not sexy, but the middle is where a lot of people are. And I think there is a real thirst for thoughtful, nuanced, smart conversations, whether they happen on your podcast, which is what you're doing, challenging narratives, staying true to yourself and to the region, being kind, or whether it's through books that are really about explaining the world and a complex situation in ways where people go, aha, now I get it. And I'm so humbled by the reactions I got to Black Wave. I got people writing to me from Belfast in Northern Ireland, from Brazil, from Italy, and not just the Middle East, saying, now I get it. Thank you. And
Yeah.
even if only 10 people have read the book, and of course there were many, many more, and come back with this reaction, then I feel that I've done my job and at least, managed to reach these 10 people who have come away with a better understanding of the region that we live in.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that the book you wrote is the book you wrote rather than The Secretary, The Journey of the Traveling Policy Briefing.
Or The Sisterhood. Yeah. I mean,
the Sisterhood of the Traveling
one day maybe
Policy.
I will lighten up and I'll write something fun, but I don't know when that day will come.
So I want to ask you, before we get to the podcast, I want to ask you just one question. And, many people lament sort of the death of journalism in the States and how journalism is in crisis and,
the death of journalism everywhere, frankly.
Exactly. So this is what I wanted to ask you about. In the Arab world, do you feel like journalism is under attack in precisely the same way or in different ways because of the landscape that we live in?
So the problem of journalism in the US and the problem of journalism in the Middle East is similar in some ways and different in other ways. In the US, you have the issue of television, daytime TV, cable television, which has become so polarized because they're looking for the viewers, they're sensationalizing, they have all these panels, there's no in-depth reporting anymore. So that feeds a whole climate that distorts the image. You have the issue of the death of local journalism. What happens in between the East Coast and the West Coast? What happens at a local level?
Yeah.
What happens, in city council reporting, etc. Because the advertising model is the business model is kind of dead. And so lots of newspapers closed in between the two coasts. And so then you end up with the big newspapers, the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, which do a great job, a fantastic job, but they're not reporting on necessarily local elections. And so you have a big gap in knowledge about what is unfolding in America, which is I think why so many people were surprised by the results of 2016. And the lack of advertising means that you have big tycoons who are buying up newspapers, slashing the workforce, closing foreign bureaus, which means that you still have good reporting, but less reporting about the outside world for an American viewership. And it has to be sensationalized a little bit or summarized or simplified. I mean, I'm doing research into the 80s and looking at coverage of American papers of the 80s in Lebanon. And the level of detail articles is, to me today, mind-boggling, because you would never be able to publish that in the New York Times today. Your editor would think, oh, that's way too complicated. Can you simplify? Now, in the Middle East, the problem is a little bit different, but it's also tied to, and I'm very sorry about the slight squeaking in the background. I forgot to take away my dog's squeaky toy, which she has just found. And so she's trying to tell me that perhaps she wants to play, but I'll try to keep her as quiet as I can. The problem in the Middle East is that you have a lot of state-funded, state-owned media that have never given us the right picture, the truthful reporting, because it's agenda-driven by the state, it's top-down. You have some independent media, or I don't even want to say independent media. I mean, Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera are not independent, but they're a bit more out there, they're a bit more forward, or they used to be. But now I find them both to be incredibly agenda-driven.
Not directly state-run.
not directly state-run. Yes, that's a good way of putting it. But still catering to a specific agenda. And increasingly, you have a lot of great independent online platforms like Daraj in Lebanon, like Rasif, like Mada Masr. But it's a tough battle, it's an upward hill that is a lot of work, but very worthy of support. And we need to be able also to have a discussion about subscription models, because these organizations, these news platforms cannot continue to operate with grants and fundraising. They need to be able to find this business model that allows them to be sustainable and independent. But leadership is just not ready, apparently, in the Middle East to pay even, a small fee or a small subscription rate to make these platforms sustainable.
Before we go onwards, I want to talk about People Like Us, the podcast, because I think it's a really exciting project. So I'm curious to hear from you. You're 6 episodes in. You're in the middle of the first season. What has the response been?
The response has been really great. It's been really heartwarming. I'm so thrilled for the team that has worked so hard on it, to see the kind of responses we've been getting, again, from around the world. Similarly, as Black Wave and as the Secretary, I wanted to speak to an audience in the Middle East and in the rest of the world, including the US, where we have our biggest audience at the moment. The idea came from, I was approached by Project Brazen, the production house that we're working with, and they really wanted me to do a podcast, but I wasn't very keen on getting back on the road and doing a reported nonfiction narrative podcast, because 20 years on the road, I just I wanted to move on from that, and I wanted to do something a bit different, which is why I left news reporting and journalism, and I'm focusing on books, because also, and that's partly in answer to your previous question, I feel that journalism is a bit broken for me. I'm still trying to reconcile with our coverage of the Syria uprisings and why that didn't have an impact on public opinion, the role of disinformation, and the 2016 election and the role that the media played in partly, bringing up the income that it brought us. So I came up with the idea of a conversation show that would be a conversation about the Middle East, but for a global audience, which would help challenge the narrative, highlight the incredible diversity of voices we have in the region, and kind of show how we're all in it together. We're all worried about some of the same things, whether it's accountability, impunity, corruption, climate change, what the hell happened from Afghanistan to Hong Kong to Beirut, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, what that means for reproductive rights outside the role. So it's really connecting the dots between the Middle East and the rest of the world, and having an equal conversation that essentially says, we're all in it together. Listen to us, and we'll listen to you. And we're all, we're all people with the same concerns about the future.
Do you see for seasons 2 and sort of beyond, or I should say for the rest of season 1 and beyond? When I heard People Like Us, I thought, okay, maybe this is actually going to broaden, and maybe the stitching that stitches the entire season together and the entire series together is going to expand to Latin America and to Africa and to other parts of the globe. Is that the idea, or is the idea to remain focused on understanding what makes the Middle East, understanding what the Middle East is going through and how what it's going through is connected to what the rest of the world is going to as well?
I really think we're missing a program, a platform, a show that gives space to all these voices in the Middle East. There are a lot of great podcasts, including yours, including a lot of the great work that Kerning Cultures is doing for a regional audience, for the Arab diaspora, and for an international audience. What we're doing with People Like Us is connecting the Middle East to the rest of the world. And so we have people from outside the Middle East in the show. We have Olena Sotnik from Ukraine talking to us about, what Putin's invasion of Russia, what Putin's invasion of Ukraine looked like to her as somebody who had warned about Putin's military actions in Syria back in 2016. right? So we're really connecting the dots between this region and the rest of the world. So yes, we will have conversations with people outside of the region, but I don't think we'll have an episode that is completely focused on, events in, Brazil. I would want to have something that connects events in Brazil to what we're going through in the region, where perhaps we'll talk about corruption. How are they tackling corruption, and how is Iraq tackling corruption?
Yeah.
We have the first episode of the season where we have a woman from Afghanistan, Muqaddasa Yurish, we have somebody from China, and we have somebody from Lebanon, Lina Munzer, to talk about, the sense of loss of freedom at the same time in these three cities. So I would like to give a voice to people from the Middle East to be part of this show, to express themselves, to counter the narratives by just being themselves. I'm not asking anyone to put on a show, by just having an honest conversation, a candid conversation about the incredible work they're doing, about the cause that is dear to them, about the film they've just put out, and to allow people around the world to listen and connect. So and that's the balance that we're trying to strike. This show needs to be relevant for us in the region. It is a show for the region as well. So we're not dumbing anything down, but it also needs to be accessible to the world so that they can connect with some of the same concerns that we have, which they have as well.
I love it. I'm going to ask you two of our quick Q&A. I don't think we have time for all four, but I'll ask you two. One of them is, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I would love to shadow some of the great creators of our times. I would love to shadow somebody like Leonardo da Vinci. How did he do it? Prolific, multidisciplinary. What was his discipline? Some of the more recent writers, Haruki Murakami. What is their routine? What are the tricks of the trade? How do they produce so much? What is their discipline? I'm always looking for the perfect daily routine, and I'm still looking. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'm open. Amazing.
And then the other question I want to ask is, what do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think it's about, the best expression to explain is, how is the sausage made, right? How does it work? How do you do what you do? I think people are often asking me, but where did you get your news? You're on television, but who told you this? And it's sort of, or they think that my mother, for example, always asked me, but, what are you doing all day? I see you on television at, 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., but what have you been doing all the rest of the day? I said, well, I have to gather the information. I have to interview people. Then you have to edit. You have to, write your script, and you have to verify your information. So I think people are always intrigued by, what does the day look like, and where do you get the information? How do you verify? Which is a very important question these days because of issues with disinformation and media literacy, which, should be taught in schools. And then the other thing that I think people misunderstand is when
Before you go on, Kim, I just have to say, it is so heartwarming to know that the mother of a New York Times bestselling author and journalist also says, what have you been doing all day? That's very heartwarming. I appreciate that tremendously.
And so the other question, the other thing that I think people misunderstand, particularly in this region where, the state has such control over the media, is they think that if you're traveling with the Secretary of State of the United States, you're somehow working for her. And so I often have people say, oh, when you worked for Hillary Clinton, I said, no. I have great admiration for Hillary Clinton, but I don't work for her. At least I didn't as a journalist. I reported on her. And by the way, I also reported on a Republican Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice and John Kerry. And that sort of also, people sort of think that if you're trying to explain a point of view, it means you are justifying it, whereas I'm just trying to shed light on the reasoning behind it.
Yeah. I mean, I find that to be a persistent misunderstanding. Before we wrap up, I have one last question for you, actually. Is Lebanon, and just because I'm here, I'm curious about this, is Lebanon still producing really great journalists?
I think so, yes. I think Lebanon is still producing great a great everything,
Like
great.
the Kim, the teenager Kim now in 2022, is she still becoming a stringer and then still working, cutting her teeth?
No, because the world of journalism has changed dramatically. I don't want to age myself, but since I started my career in 99, 98, the world of journalism and how we consume and how we produce information has changed dramatically. And also there's a lot more appreciation for stringers and fixers, and they're getting a lot more credit and bylines, which I was I was in a way at the forefront of that, pushing for some of these things to happen with a lot of other great colleagues in the field. But the world of journalism has changed dramatically. So I often get asked what would be my advice for somebody starting out. And I really have to go away and think about that, because I'm not really 100% sure. I think my one regret as a journalist is not having learned a trade, not having studied economics or not having studied law, not a trade, but because journalism is a trade, but not having studied become a graduate in a specific field, which is so helpful when you want to be a journalist and you want to cover some of the topics that we're dealing with today, like climate change or Bitcoin, etc. But I think journalism is still incredibly important, but we have to rethink the model.
Amazing. Well, Kim, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I could speak to you for hours. It's really an honor to have you on the series.
Thanks for having me, Mikey.